Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zack Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington, the home of the Seattle Sounders, the champions of the CONCACAF Champions League.
That means very little to a lot of us on this side of the world, Zack, but I understand it's very, very significant for you guys.
It is. My family joined 68,000 people last night at Lumen Field in downtown Seattle, watching the Sounders beat the Pumas club from Mexico City, and that means that they'll be going to a Club World Cup in 2023 and might play the likes of Liverpool or Manchester City. So it's a step up for my beloved team.
That is pretty significant. Does that mean that one day that you might host one of said European clubs?
Well, actually, it may play into the selection of Seattle as a potential site for the what would it be, the 2026 World Cup. Because that's going to be in the United States and Canada and Mexico. It's going to be hosted by North America.
Wow.
And the fact that the final had 68,000 people at it is a demonstration that we're a serious soccer market or football market. So that may mean that we'll have some more Cup games in Seattle, which would be super fun.
It's pleasing to see America learn how to play actual football.
You know what? I agree with you wholeheartedly. Absolutely.
Very good. All right. Hey, well, we've got a great interview this week. Love talking to people who know their stuff really well from a building science point of view, and some really good passive house experience as well. But before we get into that, let's thank our sponsors.
Indeed. So everything we do at the Accelerator, including the Passive House podcast, comes thanks to our sponsors. So a big thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thank you too to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors and Proseco. And thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Awesome. All right. Well, tell us a bit about this week's guest, Zack.
Yeah, I had the great pleasure of sitting down with Marine Sanchez of RDH Building Science. And Marine is an old friend and a wonderful person and inspiring practitioner who is very, very busy consulting on projects in Toronto, Canada. So she's this senior passive house consultant at RDH, bilingual building science engineer, and passive house designer and certifier there in the Toronto office. And she's leading RDH's passive house services on the East Coast of the US and Canada. So I, am just so impressed with her work. And in her bio says, and I can attest that this is very much the case, that she's driven to make a positive impact with every project, using her passion and expertise to drive change in the industry to face this climate emergency. So we're lucky to have her doing this work, and it was a real pleasure to get to speak with her for this interview.
All right. Well, here she is, Marine Sanchez, and we'll catch up after the interview.
Welcome, Marine Sanchez, to the Passive House podcast. It's really great to have you here.
Hi, Zack.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Marine is senior passive house consultant at RDH Building Science, and has a long time leader as practitioner in the passive house space, and is also a dear friend. And we were just daydreaming about being able to reconnect in Boston at the Passive House Network conference in a couple months. So that's going to be fun.
Yeah.
So, folks who follow the accelerator and many others will know your work. And we did an interview together that was a written form interview back in August of 2020. And so this is a really fun chance to catch up and get an update on what's going on for you in Toronto and what's happening in the industry there and what's around policy. So I'm just super excited to be doing this, and really grateful that you've carved out time, because I know you are very, very busy these days. So,
Oh, that's really my pleasure, Zach.
So Toronto Green Standard, we talked about that a lot in our conversation last time. And I know that there have been developments over the last year and a half, and that this is a big year with some new stuff coming down. Could you kind of give us an update, maybe explain to listeners what the Green Standard is for folks who aren't familiar, and then how it's evolving?
Yeah, for sure. So the Toronto Green Standard is a sustainability standard that the City of Toronto created a while back. And so when we caught up, Zach, we were under version 3, which was the first version of the Toronto Green Standard. We call it TGS. It was the first version that was switching from reference targets to absolute targets in terms of energy and carbon, right? So the Toronto Green Standard will have several sections, and the one that we are focusing on is the energy one. And so the switch between 2 and 3 was really, entailing a lot of background work and really forward-thinking approaches to that update on the energy part. And TGS version 3 was coming at the table with, we are back in 2018. We have 12 years to get to net zero ready buildings. Here are the 4 steps. TGS version 3, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 being the more stringent one, getting us to that net zero ready target. So it was already like, a very good drive in terms of legislation and the City of Toronto leading the way. And what we've seen is that everything is unfolding according to plan. And now that we are in 2022, we have the next version coming into application, because every 4 years, the industry is requested to step one step higher as the minimum standard. So it's great. We're moving ahead. We're moving in the right direction. And while we're moving in the right direction, we're also hearing refinements in terms of what the higher versions are calling for, the higher tiers. And so, you start seeing, passive house is talked about. So, I work a lot in that little passive house bubble, that passive house community. So it is official that passive house certification is approved as an alternative compliance path. So it's great to see other approaches being recognized with third-party verifications. You see also the more in-depth requirement around embodied carbon. So you can see that we're really starting to move in the right direction. So yeah, it's absolutely great. We're seeing this for Toronto. BC was leading the way with the BC Energy Step Code, which is kind of a lookalike to the Toronto Green Standard. New York is also doing a lot. So finally, we're seeing some momentum, and it's definitely in the right direction. So
yeah,
we're getting there.
Definitely. It's really great to hear. So you mentioned this notion of absolute energy standard or energy targets versus reference, and passive house is about absolute energy. Why is that shift so important?
I think first and foremost, it's really important to compare apples to apples. If I was to tell you, well, building A is 25% better than its reference building back in 2018, but, building B is 50% better from its reference building back in 2016, you might not know which one was the best of the two, right? So I think just talking apples to apples about being able to compare different buildings. Again, absolute targets don't apply just to energy. Carbon, is the same. And so it really helps us understand where our buildings are located on the scale of, your entire portfolio, or how the city is doing, or how the nation and the world is doing, right? In terms of carving or greenhouse gas emissions. I think for me, this is really like point number one. And point number two, it's also giving independently to where you're starting with your absolute metric, thinking about existing buildings as well. Where do you start? It gives a very clear picture as to where you should end up, right? We're talking about designing high performance, net zero ready new buildings. We're talking about deep retrofit, about existing buildings. All of this has to fit within the allowance that you get given. And talking in absolute metrics is the perfect way to manage that allowance, right? All these energy and carbon budgets that we get given on different projects, it's the same as a financial budget. It's just a different budget that you have to manage. And I think that that concept is core to the shift that the industry has to go through, because we're only the messenger, as energy modelers. We're not the one taking every, single design decision on any project, right? We're just translating them back into that energy budget or carbon budget management. And for the team to speak that language and also have a really clear, this is how much you have. You can spend it however you want, but when we're done, we're done. Yeah. There's no extra, and I have a few dollars in my pocket. And so I think the absolute metric approach to the vocabulary that we're using, be it financial, being energy, be it, operational carbon, embodied carbon, all of these items, it's just the way forward for us to understand our impact and then manage it.
It makes so much sense. Yeah, we really need that clarity. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've alluded to this a little bit, but can you talk about the momentum that you're seeing in passive house adoption in Toronto and Ontario, and like, is there momentum? Is it sufficient? What are the factors that are playing into that momentum, or that could accelerate it? What's going on?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad to report that first, yes, there is momentum. So this is like really exciting for the community. We are starting to see quite a lot of high performance and passive house projects popping a little bit everywhere. I think some that are very key to take note of are the one from community housing. So we probably touched on that back, 2 years ago, but Toronto community housing is progressing ahead with their passive house pilots, really understanding that that is the standard they have to deliver to, and they're trying it ahead of the curve, which is honestly brilliant because it's a win-win situation for everybody involved, with the occupants, first, I think, in terms of experience, quality of life in these buildings. Ottawa community housing has also created a lot of momentum out there. They are going through several passive house pilots all at the same time. They are touching on smaller new build and bigger new builds for designing, like a larger one, which includes a couple of 9 and 18-story towers to passive house. So again, you're like, okay, now we're talking good size. We're not just down to the single family. And I have been also very impressed with Ottawa community housing because they are starting the retrofit pilots at the same time as the new built one. So they are already talking about NFIT/high performance deep retrofit. So again, this is great. And I think that it makes a lot of sense because they have that long-term view. be it about climate change, climate impact, occupant quality of life, carbon tax, which is very, it will drive a lot of industry here in Canada over the next few years. And again, maintenance, upgrade, budget management, not even just energy budget, but financial budget management with all your capital cost planning. So I think it's just a win-win situation there. We've also seen additional momentum on the private sector, which is great. So I think one of our most demanding projects at the moment is a 60-story tower. So again, you don't get that every day, but people are figuring out how to do that. And
how many stories?
60.
Yeah.
Yeah, 60. So that's quite a lot of passive house for you. But it's okay. It's just like learning, to get to that next size after the kind of 10, 12, 15, 20 story. You're now, moving on to the next level. Vancouver is doing it, so I think we're just catching up to them, which is great. But when you look at the typology that we have in downtown Toronto, this is something we have to understand anyway, because we're going to start with a few of these new builds, which are popping along, the downtown core and key areas. But we will then have so many existing towers to retrofit as well. So understanding that switch to panelization, tighter spaces, new issues to new constraints, design constraints to design, I guess, and construction constraints to work around. But no, this is great. So yeah, I would say a lot of momentum, which is great. TGS is definitely leading the way, because I believe even if other municipalities have really good projects, I think that TGS is giving that path forward, that guidance as to do not fear for the future. This is where we're going. I am giving you certainty that
right.
These topics are not going away, and you will have to deal with that. So Hamilton, Brampton, a few other municipalities are ahead with some projects, but not yet over TGS requirements. But as a passive house advocate and very passionate person about us fighting climate change, is it enough? Probably not quite for a big city. We are building a lot of buildings out there, and all the towers that are coming up are towers that we're probably going to have to renovate within the 10, 15, 20-year time frame. So still more to do.
Yes. Well, you touched on a lot of stuff there that I think we'll enjoy diving into, like the question of retrofits and carbon tax. You also just pointed to I think something that's so important about the Toronto Green Standard, or TGS, and also the STEP code, and that's the certainty that it provides for the industry. Like, this is where we're headed. This is the end goal. And so you can wait and do this incremental changes until you're forced to do the highest level, or you can jump to it now and learn how to do it. And I think, as in my time advocating for more progressive building energy code in Washington State, I've definitely had conversations with builders who are frustrated with this, the idea that they have to kind of relearn the code every three years, because we're on a 3-year cycle where there's an opportunity to improve the code, and that this, I think this idea among at least a segment of the building community is that if I just knew where we were headed, I could just learn how to do that. It's wasteful for us as a business to be relearning every 3 years. It'd be much better just for us to take a leap and go do it. So I think that's such an important piece of the way that the policy is being made in Canada around buildings. It's really great, really great.
I agree. You see different types of builders and different types of clients, but the one really looking ahead, they do understand the the fact that the intermediate steps are very temporary.
Right.
Right? It's like you can figure it out, but you understand that you cannot keep this recipe forever. So yeah, definitely I can see the certainty of these standards just guiding the industry towards the end goal.
Right. So carbon tax. Can you
Yes.
share with us what where the carbon tax is right now and how it's driving, whether it's driving passive house adoption already, and how you see that moving forward in the future?
Yeah. Okay. So in Canada, what we've had is the carbon tax, gathered under the price of, natural gas mainly. That's what we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And more or less, the carbon tax get added to the utility cost, and we have clear, again, to your point, Zach, actually, we have clear guidance from the government that carbon tax is ramping up all the way to set targets. So this is very helpful into guiding our clients and looking at utility costs, 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So last year we were at $40 per ton. This year we just switched to $50 per ton. So we're getting a $10 to $15 increment every year, all the way to $170 by 2030.
Wow.
Right.
That's great.
So this is right, eight years away. And we don't have as much certainty after the $170 per ton by 2030. But every single project over the last year, I would say, solidly, have had to, every municipal and federal projects in the RFP, you are seeing the requirement to use a shadow carbon tax price of $300 per ton.
Wow.
So when people are, or when clients are looking ahead and having a long-term view on their asset, this is what they're planning for. So it already gives you a clear guidance there. And so I think, again, it has been incredibly powerful, because even the switch between 20, 30, 40, and $50 per ton over the last 4 years is not as significant as the jump that we're going to foresee in the future. I used to have projects where it was purely about utility costs. Gas is cheaper than electricity. Marine, I understand your point. I know that gas will have higher greenhouse gas emissions, but my project is still going to be on gas. Yeah. Whereas now, when we present that set of information, we have the vast majority of them deciding to go either for an all-electric or for a hybrid option with phasing out the gas, because they understand that the building they build today will be in operation for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And with where the carbon tax is ramping up to, it is no longer viable. So it becomes a very powerful tool to just explain to the client, this is what you're looking at if all your utilities are still on cost over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And knowing if they install a gas boiler today, they would probably not even get the return on investment before having to look at other options to make it more feasible financially. So extremely powerful, both in the new build situation, where honestly, I have seen a big switch over the last 2-3 years of design, and also on the retrofit side again, because we are looking at, well, what if I was to do nothing? And people think that the baseline remains unchanged. But you're like, well, almost everything remains unchanged, but your temperatures are getting tougher to deal with in winter and in summer. Your carbon tax is ramping up. Your, maybe the legislation coming up for existing building energy codes might get tighter and might not let you replace equipment with fossil fuel based equipment, and all these little nuggets. And then you can see that your baseline is no longer valid. Your baseline is slowly sinking down, and no matter if people are acting tomorrow or in 5 or 10 years or 20 years, for them to have this information is very powerful for them to plan.
Definitely. So what more about, let's dive more into the retrofits question. I mean, and as you were talking also, I was just thinking about how, in some ways the local law 97, I mean, it's a very, in New York, which
Yeah.
caps greenhouse gas emissions for buildings of 25,000 square feet or larger there. And that cap gets more and more stringent over time. That's having, obviously a similar
Huge impact.
effect
Yeah.
on thinking about these existing buildings. And it's a penalty. So it's a different, it's different from a tax. It's a big penalty. But it's, in some ways it's very similar to a carbon tax, because if you don't comply, you gotta pay. So what other pieces of the, what are some of the other drivers for developers or building owners, I guess I should say, to be considering retrofits? We got the carbon tax, but what else is happening?
Yeah. So I think there is a lot when you zoom back a little bit, because we're always very focused on energy and carbon, like that's our day-to-day job, or focus, or technical skills. But if you look back, I think the case for deep retrofit it should be a no-brainer. But I don't think we have a very good vocabulary and a very good system to to almost translate all these benefits into dollar signs and just have a very simple addition at the end and say, oh, okay, it's positive, it's worth doing it. We know it's going to be worth it, but we haven't translated all these benefits. But what are we going to look at? There will be some legislation, right? Some drive from the legislation standpoint, right? We know that, again, in New York, in BC, in Toronto, I believe that this year is the year where we're going to see the existing building energy code, which starts stating that if you are touching something, it needs to be replaced so that you get towards that net zero ready building by 2040-ish, I think, around that. We've seen a few drafts, but it's not out yet. They're already talking about the shift towards electrification. So legislation will be a driver, because what we can now still do will no longer be viable at some point because of legislation. Another point is probably occupant satisfaction and quality of life. So if you think about the existing building stock that we have here, commercial buildings are a different one, but we have a lot of MURBs, right? A lot of multi-unit residential buildings. And as much as new build always gets cooling, the existing ones might not have cooling. And when you start seeing what type of future weather we are supposed to experience in Toronto, by 2040, there's a very detailed study for exactly the 2040 decade. You can see that it's not just a little bit hotter. Like the climate change impact is significant. So ensuring that we have buildings that become more resilient against both current extreme events, like I don't need to tell you what we've seen over the last year between
the heat dome in Seattle and Portland and British Columbia. I mean, it was just astounding.
Crazy. Yeah,
totally.
I'm from Europe. Like the floods that we saw in the middle of Europe, like over the summer, like you look everywhere and these things are happening. So resiliency against extreme events today, and again, it might have been a few years, but we haven't had a power cut in the middle of winter, but we're going to get another one of these at some point. So really think summer and winter extreme events, as well as just more common predicted weather over the next several decades, So you need to understand until when your building will be operational, and then be able that your building can either cope with the predicted scenarios, or be able to be to receive adaptation measures to then be able to answer to these conditions after the adaptation measures have been done. So again, from that occupant standpoint and resiliency, especially with the elderly community, really thinking about what we're doing there. I don't know, maintenance issues, because again, when you're starting to work through that, you are, I'm guessing, you are using your financial budget more wisely, right? You are planning ahead so that your end package can add up to something that will last you a long time, rather than only doing some kind of like-for-like replacement, which will actually fall short of the scenarios that you're going to have to that you're going to have to cover to be ready for. So I think there's a lot there. Even insurance purposes, like we're not thinking as wide now, but we can see that flood, overheating, all these climate change consequences that we're seeing, the insurance companies are starting to catch up with that, because they're seeing this happen.
Yeah.
So you get a lot of, it's like win
Right.
situations where
Right.
you're just aligning a lot of different goals under the same umbrella.
Yeah.
For that deep retrofit.
Right. Very, very compelling case. And then you add on the carbon tax to all that, and
Yes.
I mean,
the dollar signs start to align a bit more.
Yeah, exactly. I just think about myself decades ago in environmental economics class, and learning about the importance of a carbon tax, and then seeing the results here that are beginning to take shape in the real world on buildings. It's my sort of technocratic geeky policy self is very excited by this. Super cool. So I think that one of the things you've also talked about is there are lots of different ways that we're seeing innovation go on in buildings. So passive house design is one, but offsite construction is another. And so could you talk about a little bit about that, how that confluence, or how those are interacting with one another, what you're seeing in your practice? Because I know it's not just about passive house, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. You touched on a good point there, Zach. So at RDH, we come from an enclosure background, and you know that enclosure and high performance have a lot of synergy, right? You can't do high performance without a good enclosure. So we are starting to see more and more integration from energy and enclosure and facade development all together. And I think that where this is coming from goes back to that shift in the industry, the need for these energy budget managements, right? Energy budget and carbon budget management approaches, right? We talked about this, be it from wherever it can come from a lot of different places, these budgets, right? But in any case, we will have all these energy, carbon, and financial budgets to manage. And for us to do so efficiently and in a efficient, viable way, and aiming to de-risk the project, well, what is your number one solution? Your number one solution is to think about everything early. So you're not designing everything at day one, but you're trying to think a little bit about everything at day one, so that there are no surprises later down the line. You set all your blocks, all your subdivisions of your pie really early, and the rest of the design is effectively confirming that each element is using the right amount of the pie that we had set aside to start with. So you do the same with a financial budget. You wouldn't start at day one and only look at A, B, and C and say, oh, D and E, don't worry, they figure it out on site during construction. Like, you don't have to, you'd be like, no. If it's going to cost me anything, I need to know that it has been accounted. And so that early, like I call it early stage integrated design, because it has to be way earlier than what we typically do as an industry. And it has to be integrated because you want everybody at the table. That is the way to get the most efficient and optimal design from day one without a lot of design iteration, which takes time and money, right? So with everybody at the table, your early stage integrated design approach to looking a little bit at everything at day one and stating high level strategies, which will then translate into a more detailed design and then down to a product and then installed on site. This means that energy modelers are asking more questions earlier. But if you are to work with mass timber or panelization, you now have a lot of other people at the table asking other types of questions early. If you are the architect who is supervising the whole design approach and you have a clear understanding of these energy and carbon budgets, you will also ask all these questions really early. If you're a client and you want to de-risk your project, you want to understand that what design decisions and what path we're going down has already looked a little bit at everything and confirmed that we are splitting all our budgets wisely and in a fair, in the most optimal way, whatever that means for each particular project. So you can see that, again, a lot of the design and client and construction team have a lot of benefits to being at the table really early and doing that early stage integrated design approach together. And so I think once you start seeing this, items like, panelization, mass timber, other like even modular design, these make a lot of sense because they're also completely in sync with the way we're designing. Mm-hmm. And we will probably, no matter what, need these tools when we start getting to a certain size of projects, right? It doesn't mean that you can't use it on any particular one, but when you look at, a 60-story tower or the retrofit of, 50, towers that are each like 20-story plus right. in downtown Toronto, I don't think you're going to do this by hand, mm-hmm. one, one area at a time. Like we're going to need to have that technology. So it all combines in a really nice way. But I guess the hardest point for the industry, I believe, is just that change of mentality, right? We are used to designing buildings in a certain way. And I think even if, coming from Europe is still a little bit more spoiled than North America in terms of market options and, what is available at the moment locally. We're getting there. It's not the technology that becomes your main barrier. It's really that shift in design, everybody at the table from day one, thinking about all aspects of the design and really putting energy and carbon as well as cost at the core to start with, right. And moving from there.
Yeah.
But if we get that, I don't think that we, the sky's the limit then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It makes it's a reflection of our recognition too as an industry that energy, we've traditionally had a focus on energy, and then that's shifted to a focus on operational carbon. And then now more recently has now encompasses embodied carbon.
Yeah.
And so, you're talking about mass timber and panelization and, different approaches to construction and thinking about like all of that in order to address all of those things holistically and in a smart way. It requires a different level of rigor in the early decision-making process that really, really makes sense.
Exactly.
I imagine that's pretty exciting to be doing.
It is, but I'm not going to deny. Yeah, exactly. I would say exciting and hard, but that's an accurate description. But yeah, I think, Zach, what it is, it's a very delicate balancing act, because you really have to look at everything. There is potentially no part of the building that you can easily disregard, saying, well, that won't have an impact on my energy or carbon, like most elements will likely have an impact. So you have a very delicate juggling act to do, because you are looking at so many different disciplines and so many design elements that you have to work with. But I think what is needed as well is good communication skills, because I'm only gathering that info and digesting it to feed back to the design team. But I am not doing this alone. Without my entire design team and client team, I would not be able to do so. So making sure that we're, great communicator and transferring our knowledge to each discipline so that they can go away, work on their design, and come back. It is something that we're not so used to, because I think we used to design a little bit more in silo. Mm-hmm. So really that skill of looking at everything at day one, which is, a little bit outside of the comfort zone for most design teams at the moment, but we're getting there. And then making sure that the communication is wide open in both ways, because it takes a whole team, right? It takes a village to do that.
Yeah, right. Sort
There's
of by definition.
No two ways about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has really been very fun, and inspiring to hear what the momentum that's going on. Also, I mean, I'm jealous. I'm jealous of what's going on north of the border. But actually, there's some really exciting stuff happening in the United States too now, and New York and Boston are really leading the way. I hope that Seattle will at some point step up as well. So I would be remiss before we close. I would be remiss in not asking you for just an update on the University of Toronto Scarborough student residence, because we've had a couple of presentations about this really cool project at our live events, and I'd love to hear just an update of where is it at.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm excited about this project. So the big news are that construction is working well. The structure is out of the ground. All the windows are installed. Good high performance windows. The insulation and the fiberglass clips are already on. We've started doing guarded airtightness tests because of scheduling and sequencing on these large buildings. We cannot afford to keep the entire airtightness layer exposed before testing the whole building. But the preliminary tests that we've had have been positive. They've been under the targets that we've set ourselves when we've started slicing the building into smaller chunks. So this is very exciting. And the other big piece of news is that we received our pre-certification assurance letter from PHI.
Nice.
Over Christmas. That was like a wonderful Christmas gift, but that literally says that on paper our building is certifiable, which wasn't a small milestone, because we do have a fairly big commercial kitchen tucked away in the corner, in addition to the 800 beds. So understanding, like getting that reassurance that we made it on paper, and now it's just about quality assurance and quality management. It's also a big relief. So I think the university is happy with that. So maybe for whoever is in Toronto this summer, maybe we'll get to do a few tours.
Fun.
And then maybe occupancy, early next year. So
wow,
we're getting there.
Nice. Congratulations. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you want to add before we close up? Thanks again for your time.
No, Zach, I think it's all good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks, Marine. And we'll see you in Boston.
Sounds good. Bye.
And that was Marine Sanchez, who is with RDH. And I was really pleased when you sent me this interview to have a listen to, Zack. I know of RDH, their reputation is kind of spread around the world, not just through the Passive House Accelerator, but I've had experience with the RDH team from years ago working as a building surveyor, and when we were reaching out to the leaders in the space of building science, RDH kept coming up, and some of the key players right up to the people at summer camp and some of those building science experts that I'm sure will be well known to people. So it's really great to have one of their team on the ground who is doing work in the passive house space. And I guess one of the things that jumped out at me, well, not really jumped out, but it was just so apparent in this conversation, is that coming together of building science and passive house, and it's just a really nice confirmation that passive house makes a lot of sense when you look at the fundamentals of building physics and building science.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people will know RDH through Monty Paulson, who helped make the first global passive house happy hours happen, and has been a really important voice on the accelerator. He's based in Vancouver, and then John Straub. You mentioned the building science or the building science summer camp. John Straub was a thought leader at Building Science Corporation for many years, and is a professor, and now is also with RDH Building Science. He actually just spoke at the Human Climate Conference that I was at in Austin, hosted by Passive House Austin. So there's many other examples of lots of deep expertise at RDH, including Marine Sanchez. So it is really great that we have that kind of depth and these sorts of science powerhouses thinking through building science challenges and solutions, and making our passive house practice effective and safe.
Yeah, and that a lot of that's about the enclosure, which is the area that people like Marine work in and her team talk about, and that's a lot of their work is figuring out how to do building enclosures, building envelopes well, from a energy, water, air, all the layers, just making them work correctly together, and that just lends itself really nicely to passive house, because that's one of the fundamentals of having a building that performs properly. So yeah, great to hear about some of the work that she's doing there. I guess the other thing that really sticks out to me anytime we talk to someone who's had experience across Canada is the step code, which we've talked about multiple times on this show and have referred back to, and I've referred to it and sent people information about it here as we even start looking at changes to our local building code. And what Marine talked about was that again, another reaffirmation of how that's working in practice by letting people know with confidence where the policies are going and what the future code is going to look like. And then it's up to them whether they choose to just do the bare minimum that's required at the time of getting consent or designing a project, or saying, hey, look, this project's going to be around for a while and we know where the code's going, so why don't we just jump ahead a few years and build to the standard that this building is going to be compared with fairly soon in the future.
Yeah, this theme of de-risking, I think, came through in the conversation, and actually really also is consistent with what you were just describing about the expertise in building enclosure, right? So, RDH has been helping to de-risk projects for clients since the beginning, right? Maybe that's one of their core competencies. And and one of the ways to do that is through building science and the building enclosure. And another way is through passive house. And then this step code helps kind of in a different realm de-risk, because there's certainty about where things are headed, and knowable steps to get there, and also an understanding that if you reach and you go all the way, there's reward there. So it's interesting that as you were speaking, just that, kind of the multidimensional de-risking that's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, just distracted by multidimensional because I did go and see Doctor Strange this week. Yeah.
So, nice. I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm very much in the multiverse thinking right now, but I think that lines up nicely to the whole area of often green building is seen as doing less bad, and that's part of de-risking is just doing less bad. So you're not going to run into trouble, but there's so much opportunity to go beyond that, particularly from an energy, comfort, and carbon point of view, as we try and get closer and closer, and then actually achieve net zero for buildings, so that we're not only de-risking and reducing liability, but actually there are positives to be gained from that, whether it's being a first, doing great marketing, or being a market leader, or potential real financial incentives for getting to that level of performance as well. So some really exciting stuff happening across the board. You did mention that you were slightly jealous of Marine and the progress. I think the point there for me is that Canada has been a bit of a leader in this space, and that started from a handful of people probably in Vancouver, and has rippled out from there, and has had an influence, much like individual passive house projects can have an influence in their local area. People come and visit, and people, tradespeople, specialists work on those buildings, and it ripples out and spreads from there. But that's not to say that there isn't exciting things also going on in other parts of the world. And it's great to see that influence extending beyond the physical border and across the rest of the world. We're seeing great firsts and new initiatives taking place in the space.
That's very true. Right. I mean, and there are other really great examples in the States, like Local Law 97 in New York, and what is called Birdo in Boston, and other examples. And since doing this interview, the Washington State Building Code Council voted overwhelmingly to mandate an update to the commercial energy code here. So the code that influences larger residential buildings and commercial buildings, to require all electric space and water heating in most of those buildings. So a really and also important energy efficiency improvements. So big step forward. And on a in terms of state energy code, now that Washington State is probably is arguably the leader in the U.S. It's, of course, it's not pegged to passive house. But that's okay. I mean, it's not necessarily a straight road. One of the
step in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely a step in the right direction. And one of the things that I was reminded when I was in Austin, Austin feels like where the Pacific Northwest was on passive house maybe 10 years ago or something, where there are the first projects are getting completed. There's a number of single family projects. There's an affordable housing project that's I think underway or completed. I think it actually is completed by now. And I just, as I look back, as I was there in Austin and looking back at the history of passive house in the Northwest, I was just reflecting on really how incredibly powerful those examples are. It does. I think sometimes it's easy to feel like, oh, I'm just doing this little, 2,000 square foot house or 1,500 square foot house or whatever. but those become examples for other builders, and for, in so many ways, there's this ripple effect that really does make a difference. And I was reminded that, like, I need to get a hold of the PHI data on their projects in North America, because I'm sure it's similar in terms of growth. But for FIAS passive house buildings, they're now more than doubling the number of units every 2 years, and more than doubling the amount of square footage that's been constructed every 2 years. And now these numbers are actually getting significant. And it's partly thanks to those, like the work of those early pioneers in different markets is super important. So
exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, well, great interview, and great connections. And there are we'll put some other links, because Marine's already featured on the Passive House Accelerator in the past, so we can put some links to an article and video there for some more great content from RDH as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us about what else is going on the accelerator and around the place.
Yeah, so at the accelerator this week on Wednesday our time, so Thursday your time, at Passive House Accelerator Live Construction Tech Edition, we'll have Jeremy Avellino from Bright Common in Philadelphia, and Ilka Cassidy, who listeners will know as one of our frequent guest co-hosts, along with Mary James. So Jeremy and Ilka will be presenting the 06 Urban Passive House in the New Age of Adaptation. And they'll be going into the details of that project, which will be really cool. And then tons of stuff happening in the broader Passive House community. So conferences are up and running now in North America. So Passive House Northwest it has its first conference in, I think, since before COVID. It's a mini conference on May 20th. It's a single day in Olympia, Washington. This one I do not think is online, so it's only for listeners who are in the Pacific Northwest, but it should be really excellent. It's Passive House and Panelization. And it will feature Sean St. Amour as the MC. So Sean St. Amour of Passive House Accelerator Live fame. So please join us for that. I'm looking forward to that one. And then Passive House Canada has its conference, and that's a hybrid conference. So this one is actually available both in person and online. And that's happening in beautiful Victoria, British Columbia, May 25th through 27th. And the theme is In the Face of Climate Change. So it'll be, I'm sure there'll be deeper dives into the themes that we've been exploring during these conversations with folks like Marine Sanchez in Canada. So, and there's a lot more as well. The PHN conference is coming up in June, and the FIAS conference is coming up in October. So we'll have a link to those events in the show notes.
Awesome. So much great stuff. Hey, well, thank you for that, Zack. Thanks to our great guest this week, and to you, our listeners out there. Love to hear from you. If you've got any questions, comments, feedback, or suggestions for future shows, please get in touch. You can email us, podcast@passivehouseaccelerator.com. We'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back again next week with another episode.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks.